Thank you. And should we be trying to figure out if the Torah agrees with or knows about the discoveries of modern cosmology or paleontology?
So I think that that question relates to the last one, and I think it's a good opportunity to start by asking a sort of sub-question, which is, what does the Torah think science is? Or maybe I already maybe tried to point at that a bit obliquely just now, but more explicitly, where does the Torah talk about science, or can you argue that it's talking about that? And we don't have to cover like everywhere where I would argue that it is. Like I think, for example, in the narrative in Sefer Bereshit that's about Yosef HaTzadik, there's a whole discourse about scientific reasoning and what can be discovered about the world with it that I think you can argue there from the text, but we don't have to dive into that right now. But just basically looking at Bereshit, like what I was saying before, that this idea that naming and creation are inseparable, that you develop a vocabulary for the world. This is again like Wittgenstein was a very Jewish philosopher, even though I think his parents were converted Jews or something like that. So he maybe wasn't technically fully a Jew, but he is a very Jewish set of attitudes in his philosophy, which frustrated a lot of other philosophers. And he has this quotation like, "Die Grenzen meiner Sprache bedeuten die Grenzen meiner Welt," or something like that. I may have screwed up the grammar there, but that the borders of my language are the borders of my world. Like he, totally separately from talking about Torah, was pointing out that your choice in how you talk about things sort of redefines the boundaries and the sort of the slices that you're taking out of the fabric of reality and saying this is one thing and this is another thing. This is where the table stops and the rest of the world begins. And so your vocabulary and terminology are essential in that. I think that's actually a central point in the beginning of Ma'aseh Bereshit and Sefer Bereshit, the beginning of the work of creation in the book of Genesis, that you have the verb likro to name things, you have the verb livro to create things, and they're not separable. They are entwined in such a way that, or intertwined in such a way that part of the creating of something is to give it a name. And what that's pointing out to us is that we have different ways we can characterize the world that best capture different aspects of the truth about them. And that doesn't mean that all languages are equally good, but it does mean that we play the role of the translator. And the reason I think that's important for these questions about the past, like when you now say, okay, what about the Big Bang or dinosaurs or whatever, how are we supposed to understand this talking about the Torah, is I think that if you go to the beginning of Sefer Bereshit and have that understanding of what scientists are doing, meaning that DNA is not a thing, or electrons are not a thing that had this freestanding, completed existence that was independent of the development of a language for characterizing them. I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not trying to talk in magical terms and saying somehow that like the power of words has like that magically conjures the completion of a thing into reality, and trying to speak that way. That I think sounds variably either a bit Christian or a bit Kabbalistic, and I think there's a lot of commonality in how Christianity and Kabbalah talk about words and their power that probably stem both from Gnosticism in some way, but that's like a whole other topic.
Well, I would like to get into that, but maybe on another show. But that's a great topic, right up my alley.
So, but in any case, I'm not talking about sort of like the magical power of words. What I mean is that the meaning of the verbs in the Torah that are being used, what it means, bria, what does it mean to create? That creation involves speech about the created thing and naming of it, the development of vocabulary, of a theory of it. That's the meaning of the verb. And so if you haven't done that, you might have a dry expanse, but you don't have the fully created aretz, so to speak. And I think that the natural sciences are about the development of ways of talking about the world. And they're not fully determined before people engage in the social process of convincing each other what is an effective way of talking about the world. So to the degree that that's the case, when we're talking about how the Torah understands what something like science is doing, now you can go back and say, all right, so scientists who like to say, oh, well, the Bible is nonsense because it doesn't talk about the Big Bang or what have you. One kind of answer there is, why would you assume that that is how the Torah wants to characterize the world? Like, what is the purpose of the Torah? And I'm not the only one who's made some version of this point. The Torah is a guide to the Oved Hashem. It seeks to be enabling of someone who wants to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for that person to know HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from him, and to know better how to align action and speech with the desires of the creator of the world. It might be the case that part of doing that would, it would help here and there to know what DNA is or to know what electrons are, depending on what you're trying to do in your elaborate effort of Avodat Hashem, of serving Hashem. But are those really the first things you need to know? Like, is that the starting vocabulary with which to relate to the world? Let's talk about, quark gluon plasma or something. No, the starting vocabulary for relating to the world is light and dark, and land and sea, and men and women, and fish and birds. And these are the fundamental things that, these are the ways, that the borders of the world that you set down to begin on your mission. And yes, maybe as you get very specialized and you want to cure some disease, or you want to build some technology that will maybe be useful in the course of serving Hashem, you also want to invent the vocabulary of electrons or what have you. But did we need to start there? No. And in fact, it would be misleading and distracting to start there. So the Torah doesn't start with that way of characterizing the world. It characterizes it differently because it's focused unswervingly on helping you to know Hashem and to learn better to do what he asks of you. So now that we've said that, this question about paleontology or cosmology or whatever, a first answer to that simply is, it should not be presumed that this is a way that the Torah is interested in talking about the world. And that doesn't mean, so to speak, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't know about these things and would have put them in the book had he only known. That's sort of speaking in a cartoonish joke of a way, but it's kind of, in a sense, the way that many scientists who deride biblical religion are inclined to talk about this. But that's not the way I think to put it. The way to put it is that you need a reason to talk about the world a certain way that serves the ends of Torah in order for the Torah to take up the subject. And it might not have had that reason. However, the other thing I'll say is that it might indeed find reasons in places that we don't necessarily expect it. But when it does, it's not going to do that just to sort of prove that it's smart. I don't think that the Torah ever just winks at you and says, well, on the surface, this seems to be a document that is written, in a certain genre and with a certain way of talking about the world. But secretly, this is written by the creator of the world. And so I have to prove that to you. And in order to prove that to you, I will hide information about what I know about DNA here, and I'll hide information about what I know about dinosaurs there. But there's no point to any of it other than just to convince you. I don't think the Torah is trying to convince us that it's true. It's a brit, it's a covenant. It says, if you make yourself a party to this agreement, then here's the other side of that promise. So you have to buy in, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu also has promises that he makes. So it's not saying, first figure out if this is true or not by testing it with science, and if you can make that work, then if it meets the standard of science or meets the standard of whatever other God you have, then it's good. That's not how it submits itself. But what it does do, I think, sometimes is it takes things that maybe there for us to grapple with, and realizes that there are subtextual points that are really significant in Avodat Hashem that need to be taken up. So for example, like whatever you make of paleontology, there are rocks in the ground that are shaped like the bones of giant reptiles, right? Like it's very hard to dispute that. So the scientific process of developing a story and a theory of where those rocks that are shaped like the bones of giant reptiles come from, that forensic analysis of data in the present to develop a theory or an account of the past that is consistent with certain assumptions, that's a scientific way of generating such an account of the past. You don't necessarily expect the Torah to want to reproduce or agree with that account of the past, because it may not be at all useful to present that account in the mission it's trying to enable. But there are existential aspects of the human condition that are provoked by finding rocks shaped like the bones of giant reptiles in the ground, and that is part of the human condition. And if it's part of the human condition that the Torah sees a point in engaging with, then it will do so. And so I try to argue elsewhere that that is something, a subject that the Torah takes up if you look for it in the right place, but it doesn't do it in chronological order, and it doesn't do it, at the beginning of the book of Genesis. And I think that you could say the same for cosmological things, like that the cosmic question of where everything came from is not something that you can ignore while getting into this question of what the purpose of what we're doing now is, or how it all fits together. And so I don't want to say that the Torah is definitely unable to speak of or unwilling to speak of certain subjects, but I think the point is more that they're not the main point or the surface level. They have to be excavated carefully with close reading of the text. Torah is like water, right? And what are our avot, like the forefathers, always doing? They're going around and like digging wells. And the way you dig a well is by like seeing signs on the surface and then knowing to dig down deep. Like there are aspects of Torah that you have to really dig deep to get to the water. And I think in many cases, those aspects are there, but I think to really see them, they have to be approached with the kavanah, with the intention of saying, I want to see if the Torah has something to teach me about the meaning to the human condition of the resemblance that humans have to apes, right? Instead of saying, did we descend from apes? Is that the real story, the true story, not the one that we're told in the Torah, but instead this other one that scientists are telling us? When you pose the question that way, it's not a very useful discussion. Scientists have their way of forensically back solving into the past, and it's useful for certain things, but it produces a certain kind of account of the past. If the Torah is going to engage with the question of the fact that we do resemble apes, it's going to do it because it has a point to make to you about who you are and what you're supposed to do. And I think it actually does have a lengthy way of engaging with that subject, but it doesn't do it in order to agree with the fossil record. It does it in order to help the Oved Hashem, the servant of Hashem, to reflect on who he is and what he must do.
And tying it into what you said before with language allows us to see distinctions in our world, and Adam Harishon is distinguishing humankind from the animal kingdom by giving it name, by naming the animals, right?
Absolutely.
So it actually ties into
he's a participant in the work of creation according to this understanding of naming, because he's doing some of the naming. And I think one of the things that also gives an opportunity to mention is that you might react to what I was saying about naming by saying it's too extreme a position, because while it is true that you can slice the world into different pieces with different languages, it is kind of hard to avoid, on the other hand, the notion that there are some things that are brighter distinctions than others. Like the fact that there is night and day, that's not the same thing as like, are zebras and horses two different things, or two different kinds of the same thing? Which is much more a choice in the development of a sophisticated language. Obviously, in biology, they are understood to be different species because we divide them based on whether they can co-reproduce fertile offspring or something like that. And if instead you said, well, all right, hooves and sort of a horsey looking face, and I don't care about stripes, then maybe they are the same kind of thing, So there you have this very an example where it's very possible to raise different questions about whether there's a distinction there. Night and day is harder to give up on, where you sort of say, oh, is it really just us? Like, we decided to say that there was night and day, and before that there was nothing to sort of to create instead. But I think that the way I have argued to get around that, just one second. The way that I've tried to argue for dealing with this is to say there's a distinction between the word of a person and the word of Hashem, right? Like in our tradition, there's the idea of Davar Hashem, and Davar Hashem might stand in some sense for the brightest and most real distinctions that there are in the world. That maybe you could say that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu says something, so to speak, like, what does it mean when he says something? What is the Torah saying? Is it just saying that there's a thunderous voice that sort of reverberates in the heavens and that sounds like someone with a very loud loudspeaker and they're saying whatever they're saying? I think probably that's an overly cartoonish and childish way of reading what the text is getting at. And I think that what we need to consider instead is that we learn the meaning of that from the examples that are presented in Tanakh. So when Hashem speaks, what happens as a result? And the distinctions that we get from the first instances of Devar Hashem are things like the distinction between light and dark, or between land and sea, between night and day, or elsewhere in Tehillim, in Psalms, you're going to see things like the melting of ice is directly connected with Devar Hashem. And what I like about that additional example is it's sort of proof for a theory that you could develop in the text at the beginning. You could say, okay, so maybe they're the brightest distinctions in the world are the ones that the Torah considers the most fundamental. That's what Devar Hashem has to do with. And then, like, we are co-creators, and yes, we name things, but maybe our theories and our names of things are a bit more plastic and a bit less perfect and a bit less fully coherent with the undeniable bones of reality or whatever. But when you look over in Tehillim and it says that Davar Hashem is right there when ice is melting. Ice and water is like another one of it's a phase transition. For a physicist, it's like a very bright distinction between two phases of matter, and that appeals as another way of asking this question, like, aren't there some things in the world where any language that it was accurate in describing the world would have to admit that there's a difference between ice and water that's qualitative? And that's where Devar Hashem comes in, right? Asher bidvaro ma'ari v'aravim, that Hashem brings on the evening with his word, because the setting of the sun is one of the brightest lines that we have in nature. So I think it has to be admitted that there is maybe in our tradition some notion of there are things in nature that are so undeniable as far as bright lines that we say that they are part of Devar Hashem. But most of what we're doing when we're doing forensic reconstruction of the past is a much dodgier business, even in science, meaning that when a bunch of scientists get together and they say, we all agree, right, that this fragment of something that I found, it means the following about a battle that happened between Egyptians and Aramaeans 3,000 years ago, or it means the following that happened with a meteorite hitting the Earth, or millions of years ago, et cetera, et cetera. Those are not unreasonable proposals to make based on certain assumptions, but they're not the way the Torah typically wants to talk about the past. And they also are themselves actually very methodologically subtle, like that you can make different arguments for the past based on different assumptions and ways of reasoning from the same evidence. And this is something I mentioned, the life of Yosef Tzaddik before. I've tried to argue elsewhere more elaborately that the Torah is really interested in, most principally when talking about the past, in a covenantal idea of the past, like that what in the past is assigned to you in the present about your relationship with Hashem, and where do you see those signs recurring, and how do you identify them? The contrast with that I think is most vivid is in the life of Yosef. There are two instances where someone makes a forensic case about the past that is wrong, based on what we know that happens else in the narrative. First, when the brothers dip Yosef's Ketonet Basim, his multicolored cloak or his striped cloak or whatever, in blood and show it to Yaakov, and then he thinks that means a beast has devoured Yosef, and that's not true, but the evidence is compelling, right? From his perspective, what he's seeing is, if you want to reason based on what you know about the world and what you are likely to assume based on the material evidence you have in the present, that's a perfectly reasonable account of the past to arrive at. And similarly, when Eshet Potiphar, when the wife of Potiphar is holding on to Yosef's garment, which he's presumably not wearing anymore, and she claims that he tried to rape her, that's also a plausible account based on the facts in the present. It's always the case that cosmologists and paleontologists have facts in the present, have observations in the present, and are trying to construct a theory of a sequence of preceding events that are consistent with those based on certain assumptions. And that can be interesting. It can sometimes be useful. It can sometimes be harmful, but it can sometimes be useful. But that doesn't mean it's the only account and excludes all others. And especially when we're holding it side by side with something like the 7 days of creation, to imagine somehow that we should be looking for ways in which these ways of talking agree. The first question you have to ask is, why would the Torah be trying to agree with the forensic account? Why do you assume that that is its goal? And if that apparently isn't its goal, then does that teach you something about how the Torah feels about forensic accounts of the past, and whether it has a different way of talking about the past that it considers to be more central, the same way it considers fish and birds to be more central than DNA and electrons.
And I think the distinctions that you were talking about before, actually, from a polemical standpoint, what the Torah is doing is very significant in comparison to the ancient, the ancient world that preceded the Torah. Like, for example, God is making a distinction between himself and the world that he created. Mm-hmm. And God is, the creation of light that precedes the creation of the sun is significant, because the sun was one of the chief gods of the ancient world, and the sun is created on the fourth day. And it wasn't even called the Shemesh; it was referred to kind of given a backhanded introduction into the Torah by calling it a great luminary in the sky. All these things are extremely significant. If you're learning this in a vacuum, then you don't really appreciate it. But when you're comparing it to like other ancient works, you realize that Hashem is making a distinction between himself and reality by kind of showing that he owns reality. Everything that exists is because of him. So they're insignificant in reality.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there are several points that come out of what you just said that are important to make here. One of which I think is better made by others than myself. Like I love reading Rav Professor Josh Berman on this topic. He has really
previous guest of the show.
Indeed, yeah. He has really profound insights, I think, on this kind of a topic, and of course the books of Nachum Sarna as well, that you can sometimes understand things about what the Torah is doing by comparing it to not, I would say, exactly the same genre, but let's say other ways of talking about the world that had currency in the ancient world, and then by doing a comparative analysis, you can understand what's different about the ideological system that's being articulated in the Torah, and I think that is more generally true also. Like, I won't say that you can't find things in the Torah that seem to actually be talking about some of the things that science is supposed to be talking about. Like, I've tried to engage, for example, with the text of the makot, the plagues in Sefer Shemot, and point out that there are a lot of ideas there that actually connect with things we often consider to be important for discussing biological evolution. Like, you start with a river of blood, which is like this sort of primordial soup, like the liquid essence of life. And then you have this event of mass extinction of fish that is followed by frogs jumping out onto land. So there's this sense of like selection against the fish and like the environment changing and becoming inhospitable. And then the animals that have another option move somewhere else. So the frogs jump out. And so, and frogs are not just any animal, but they're the animal that in their own lifetime recapitulates the gradual process of turning from something that looks like a fish into something that looks like a land animal because of the metamorphosis of tadpoles into frogs. So, you know, the question of why the Torah is taking up the subject of biological evolution is a longer discussion, but I think it's actually the same as sort of when you put pieces of the Torah side by side with Greek mythology or Sumerian mythology or whatever, you get to see its particular message by throwing it into relief with a different way of talking about some of the same ideas. I think sometimes you can also do that with ideas that we think of as being the province of scientific reasoning about the world. And if the Torah is going to do that, again, it's going to be to teach you something about Hashem and what his message is. I also think, though, that in particular, what you're referring to in Ma'aseh Bereshit, the idea of location of Hashem outside the world, it gets to a bigger point about the sort of too naive question of like, well, why isn't the Torah in the 7 days of Ma'aseh Bereshit, you know, the creation of the world, why isn't it talking about it and making it sound like the Big Bang if it knows what the Big Bang is, or if the Big Bang is a compelling account of the past, which according to certain assumptions and certain data, it obviously is. I think that the point there is, in the same way you were just describing, it's a question of what point is it trying to make about Hashem and to teach you about how to understand who Hashem is and how to relate to him. I think that the cartoonish way that this question is usually talked about, like say in the context of American culture wars between religion and science or whatever, which obviously is heavily influenced by the way a lot of Christians in America read their translation of the Bible, is that we all know what it means to say that God created something. And we're just arguing about whether or not that is a factually true claim or not. And this is I think, a pointless scrimmage that is fueled by people who stand on both sides of the line that don't understand what they're even talking about. Because the truth is that we shouldn't presume we know what Hashem is until we learn who he is and what he is from the Torah. The point of the Torah, a major goal of the Torah, is for us to know Hashem. And we can't learn the meaning of those words that are used, those epithets that are used to describe him, without really carefully studying the context of their usage. So if you take that understanding to the 7 days, then what you get very quickly is, this is a message to me about what the rest of this text is going to mean when it's talking about a Kadosh Baruch Hu acting in the world, meaning that you know things about the world already, like others have observed, and it's like an easy point to make, that in the 7 days you get plants on day 3 and you get the sun on day 4. You don't have to be Richard Feynman or something to realize that plants need the sun to grow. That's not an advanced understanding of sophisticated modern science. It's available to anyone at any generation, since the Torah was given. So if the Torah is going to say the sun came on day 4 and plants came on day 3, do you think that's just a typo? Is that just sort of it failed to convince you by coming up with something that wasn't plausible? It's obviously making many points like that deliberately. It's saying, okay, your understanding of the way this world works is that it takes much longer than 7 days to build a building, let alone the world. First of all. Second of all, your understanding of the world is that you can't have plants without the sun. So both in terms of duration and in terms of chronology, this text is telling you that when it talks to you about HaKadosh Baruch Hu acting on his creation, it's going to be very hard to square with your understanding of the world and how it works. That the vocabulary of the names of Hashem is being circled with a sort of a big warning sign saying, tread carefully in how you think about the meaning of this word and what is being said, because when you say Hashem did something and that truth is being told to you, it's going to sound strange and it's going to not make sense until you look more deeply at what you're being told. I think that is a principal message at the outset. And I think it would have been, I think, an easier thing actually for a sort of ancient pagan who recently converted to being a member of Am Yisrael and reading the Torah. That would be a more obvious way of reading the text, because as Professor Berman has pointed out, it didn't used to be the case that there was anything other than stories that tried to show you how to think about the world by talking about it in a particular way. So it wasn't like saying, let's use a methodology and evidence to construct a story that's consistent. That is a less common way of operating. It's the forensic way, it's the scientific way when looking at the past. It's saying instead, you know what the world is. You have the opportunity to observe it. Now I'm going to talk to you about what it is and how it originated. And the way that I do that, the claims that I make about that are going to homiletically form a kind of essay for you about what I'm trying to propose is some fundamental idea about what the world is and what it means and what we should be doing in it. And when pagans would do that with their mythology, they also were not idiots, right? Like they weren't just fools to think that like first there was snow and fire and then there was a cow and then this and then that. I mean, when someone says that, they're not just mistaken about the facts. They're doing that in order to teach you a way of looking at the world. And we have from our prophets that those other ways of looking at the world are flawed and they lead down a crooked path and all of those things. So pagan mythologies, ultimately from the standpoint of Torah, are not to be trusted. But in terms of what they're trying to do, they have more in common with, I think, some of the narrative approaches to talking about the past that the Torah is principally engaging in.
Fascinating. Well said. And the